She was a symbol of purity, known as the Black Virgin in her small village. Her life was simple until the day a billionaire Arab executive arrived, forcing her into a marriage she never wanted. What the groom asked for after their wedding day left her utterly shocked. This story will leave you speechless, revealing the twists and turns of love, power, and redemption. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more incredible and inspiring stories like this to you. Amira's life in her tranquil village was simple yet dignified. At just 23, she was admired for her grace and beauty, earning her the nickname the Black Virgin. Her flawless dark skin, luminous eyes, and serene demeanor set her apart from the others in her community. Despite her modest upbringing, she carried herself with an air of quiet pride. She dreamed of a future filled with love and independence, though the realities of her life often reminded her that such dreams were far from reach. One ordinary morning, as she swept the front of her family's small home, a sound disrupted the peaceful routine of the village. The rumble of engines echoed through the narrow streets as a convoy of sleek black SUVs rolled in, a sight no one had ever seen before. Children ran after the vehicles, and curious villagers gathered to watch. It was clear this wasn't an ordinary visit. From the leading car, a tall, commanding man stepped out, dressed in an impeccable tailored suit. Khalid al-Mansour, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the Middle East, was a name known even in this remote village. He was accompanied by a team of assistants and bodyguards, their presence intimidating. Khalid's reputation preceded him, an uncompromising, powerful man who built an empire through sheer determination. But why had he come to this obscure village? Amira's father, Ibrahim, was among those who hurried to greet the visitors. His humble stance and wrinkled hands told the story of a man who had labored tirelessly to provide for his family. Khalid, with a voice that carried both authority and intent, asked to speak privately with Ibrahim. The villagers whispered among themselves, speculating about what business a billionaire could have with someone like Ibrahim. Inside their modest home, Khalid laid out his purpose. His son, Malik, had reached an age where marriage was not just a choice, but an expectation. However, Malik was different from most young men of his stature. He was introverted, focused on intellectual pursuits, and uninterested in the superficial relationships that surrounded him in the elite circles of Dubai. Khalid believed that someone like Amira, pure and untouched by the world of wealth and power, could be the perfect match for his son. Amira's father, stunned by the offer, found himself torn. The proposal promised wealth and security beyond anything he could imagine for his family. But it came at a cost: his daughter's freedom. Khalid's tone made it clear that this was not a request, but a demand cloaked in politeness. Ibrahim reluctantly agreed, feeling the weight of his decision even before sharing the news with Amira. When Amira was told of her impending marriage, she felt as if the ground had been pulled from beneath her. Her dreams of love and choice shattered in an instant. She pleaded with her father, tears streaming down her face. But Ibrahim was firm, believing this was an opportunity to secure their family's future. Her protests fell on deaf ears, and preparations for the marriage began almost immediately. The villagers buzzed with gossip, some envying Amira's fortune, while others pitied her loss of agency. Amira, however, felt nothing but dread. She had never met Malik, and the idea of being forced into a life she didn't choose filled her with fear and resentment. Still, she knew there was no escaping what had been set in motion. On the day Khalid's convoy returned to finalize the agreement, Amira stood quietly in the corner of the room, her heart pounding as Khalid observed her with a critical eye. "You'll make a fine wife for my son," he declared, his words carrying a weight that felt suffocating. Amira lowered her gaze, swallowing the bitterness rising in her throat. As the SUVs disappeared into the horizon, leaving a trail of dust behind, Amira realized her life would never be the same. The first step in her journey had begun, and though she didn't know it yet, what awaited her in this new chapter of life would test her in ways she could never imagine. The day Amira was taken to Dubai felt surreal. As the convoy drove her from her village to Khalid al-Mansour's sprawling mansion, she was overwhelmed by the sheer grandeur of the city. Towering skyscrapers glinted in the sunlight, and luxury cars zipped past as if she had entered another world entirely. The mansion itself was a fortress of wealth, with golden gates and marble fountains, a stark contrast to the humble home she had known her entire life. Amira was ushered inside, where maids in crisp uniforms greeted her and led her to an opulent guest room. The walls were adorned with intricate patterns, and the air smelled of fresh jasmine. Yet, none of it impressed her. The weight of her situation made it impossible to appreciate the beauty surrounding her. Khalid wasted no time. That evening, he introduced her to Malik, his only son, and the man she was expected to marry. Malik entered the room quietly, his posture slightly hunched, as though he carried the weight of something invisible. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes, but there was a softness to his demeanor that surprised Amira. He didn't seem like the entitled son of a billionaire she had imagined. "Malik," Khalid said with a tone of authority, "this is Amira. She will be your wife." Malik glanced at Amira briefly before turning his gaze downward, avoiding eye contact. He mumbled something that sounded like a polite greeting, but his discomfort was evident. Amira, equally uneasy, forced a small nod. The room was filled with an awkward silence that Khalid quickly broke. "This union will bring you stability," Khalid said, his voice directed more at Malik than at Amira. "Amira comes from a humble background, untouched by the deceit and greed of the world we live in. She is exactly what you need." Khalid's words stung Amira, reducing her to a mere commodity, an object meant to serve a purpose in their world. Malik didn't respond, and Khalid soon dismissed them both, leaving them to interact on their own. As they sat together in the quiet of a nearby sitting room, Malik finally broke the silence. "I know you didn't choose this," he said softly, his voice gentle but tinged with sadness. "Neither did I." Amira looked at him, surprised by his honesty. "Then why go along with it?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Malik hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. "My father, he controls everything. My life, my choices, even my thoughts sometimes. Saying no to him isn't an option." His words resonated with Amira, who felt the same lack of agency in her own life. For the first time, she saw Malik not as a privileged billionaire's son, but as someone trapped, just like her. "I don't want this either," she admitted, "but it seems we don't have a choice." They sat in silence for a moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Though they barely knew each other, they shared a common enemy: fate, or perhaps Khalid's iron will. In the days that followed, Amira observed Malik more closely. He spent most of his time in the mansion's massive library, surrounded by books on philosophy, art, and history. He was nothing like his father, whose ambition and arrogance were as towering as the skyscrapers he owned. Malik seemed introspective, even fragile at times, as though he carried a burden no one else could see. One evening, Malik invited Amira to join him in the library. "You might like this one," he said, handing her a worn book of poetry. It was a small gesture, but it was the first time he had shown any interest in connecting with her. Amira accepted the book hesitantly. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed Malik watching her, his expression unreadable. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because," he said after a pause, "if we're stuck in this together, we might as well try to make it bearable." His words were simple, but they carried a sincerity that touched Amira. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that this forced union might not be entirely devoid of kindness. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, Amira couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Malik's quiet nature seemed to hide a deeper pain, and Khalid's controlling presence loomed over them like a shadow. The mansion, despite its grandeur, felt more like a gilded cage with secrets hidden behind every door. Amira began to realize that her journey was far from over. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would test her in ways she had never imagined. Weeks passed, and Amira's new life in the Al-Mansur mansion unfolded like a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. Despite the luxury surrounding her, she couldn't ignore the oppressive atmosphere. Malik, though kind in his own quiet way, seemed distant. He spent hours in the library or secluded gardens, lost in thought. It was as though he was carrying a secret too heavy to share. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amira wandered into the sprawling garden. The air was cooler now, and the scent of blooming roses filled the space. She found Malik sitting on a stone bench beneath an ancient olive tree, his hands clasped together tightly. He didn't notice her approach until she was only a few steps away. "You spend a lot of time out here," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Malik looked up, startled at first, but quickly relaxing when he realized it was her. "It's one of the few places that feels free," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He gestured to the bench beside him, and Amira hesitated before sitting down. There was a long pause as they both stared at the horizon. Finally, Amira broke the silence. "Why do you always seem so burdened?" Malik sighed deeply, running a hand through his dark hair. "Because I am," he said simply. "My father's expectations, his control, the constant need to prove myself in his shadow. It's exhausting." Amira studied him, her heart softening. "And this marriage?" she asked cautiously. He glanced at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe. "This marriage is just another way for him to tighten his grip on my life. He thinks marrying someone like you will ground me, make me the man he wants me to be. But it's not about us. It's about him." His words stung, but they didn't surprise her. She had suspected as much. "So, what do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. Malik looked at her, his expression softening. "We survive," he said simply. "Together, if we can." It was the first time he had openly acknowledged their shared struggle, and though it wasn't much, it felt like a step forward. Amira nodded, her resolve hardening. If she had to endure this life, she would do so with dignity. And if Malik was willing to meet her halfway, perhaps they could find a way to navigate this together. But the peace of that moment was short-lived. The next day, Khalid summoned them both to his study. The room was as imposing as the man himself, with dark wood paneling and shelves lined with expensive books and artifacts. Khalid sat behind a massive desk, his piercing gaze shifting between Amira and Malik. "I have decided," he began, his voice cold and authoritative, "that the wedding will take place in 2 weeks." Amira's heart sank. She had hoped for more time, though she wasn't sure why. Malik, standing beside her, clenched his fists but said nothing. "This union is not just a personal matter," Khalid continued. "It is a strategic move for our family's reputation. I expect both of you to act accordingly." Amira bristled at his tone, but she bit her tongue. She knew better than to argue with a man like Khalid. Malik, however, seemed less inclined to hold back. "Father," he began, his voice firm but calm, "don't you think this is too soon? Amira and I barely know each other." Khalid's eyes narrowed, and his tone turned icy. "You will do as I say, Malik. Or have you forgotten who provides for you, who built the life you live?" The tension in the room was suffocating. Amira felt an overwhelming urge to speak, to defend Malik, but she knew it wasn't her place. Khalid's power was absolute, and challenging him would only make things worse. After the meeting, Malik stormed out of the room, and Amira followed, finding him in the hallway, pacing angrily. "I can't do this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You can," she said firmly, surprising even herself. "We both can. We don't have a choice, but that doesn't mean we have to let him win." Malik looked at her, his anger slowly dissolving into something softer. Gratitude, perhaps. "You're stronger than I thought," he said quietly. "And you're not as weak as you think," she replied, offering him a small smile. In that moment, something shifted between them. They weren't just two strangers forced into an unwanted marriage. They were allies in a battle neither of them had chosen. For the first time since this ordeal began, Amira felt a glimmer of hope. Not for love, but for survival. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Khalid's control over their lives was far from the worst challenge they would face. Something darker loomed on the horizon, a truth neither of them was prepared for. The days leading up to the wedding passed quickly, filled with preparations that felt more like a spectacle than a celebration. Amira was fitted for elaborate gowns, her every movement scrutinized by Khalid's team of stylists. Malik, meanwhile, disappeared for long stretches, retreating into his library or the gardens. Despite their shared understanding, Amira began to feel increasingly alone. One evening, unable to sleep, she wandered through the mansion. The hallways, dimly lit by ornate sconces, felt eerie in their silence. As she passed by Khalid's study, she heard muffled voices. Curiosity got the better of her, and she stopped just outside the door, careful to remain hidden. "She's nothing but a pawn in this game," Khalid's voice said, low and venomous. "Once the marriage is finalized, she'll serve her purpose. Malik will have no choice but to fall in line." Amira's heart pounded in her chest. She leaned closer, straining to hear the response. "And if he doesn't?" came another voice, one she didn't recognize. "He will," Khalid replied sharply. "Or he'll lose everything. The boy needs to learn that loyalty to this family comes above all else. Amira is merely a tool to ensure that happens." Amira stepped back, her stomach twisting in knots. She had known Khalid was controlling, but hearing him speak of her so callously, as though she were nothing more than an object to manipulate, made her blood boil. She wanted to burst into the room and confront him, but she knew it would be pointless. Khalid's power was absolute, and defiance would only make things worse. Instead, she turned and fled, her mind racing. What had she gotten herself into? And what did Khalid truly want from Malik? It was clear now that the marriage wasn't about love or even tradition. It was about control. But what was Khalid so desperate to control? The next morning, Amira found Malik in the garden, sitting beneath the olive tree with a book in his lap. His face was drawn, his usual calm replaced by a tension she hadn't seen before. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Malik looked up, his brows furrowing. "What's wrong?" Amira sat down beside him, lowering her voice. "I overheard your father last night. He doesn't care about this marriage or about us. He's using me to control you." Malik sighed, closing the book and setting it aside. "I know." His admission caught her off guard. "You know?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "It's always been this way. My entire life, he's manipulated me, controlled every decision I've ever made. This marriage is just another one of his schemes." "Then why don't you fight back?" Amira asked, frustration creeping into her tone. "Why do you let him do this to you?" Malik's jaw tightened. "Because I don't have a choice. You don't understand what it's like to live under his shadow, to have everything. Your family, your future, your freedom, tied to one man's will. If I defy him, I lose everything." Amira placed a hand on his arm, forcing him to look at her. "Maybe you don't have a choice about the marriage, but you have a choice about how you live your life. Don't let him take that from you." Malik stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might argue, but then he nodded, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "You're right. I've been letting him control me for too long." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of one of Khalid's assistants, who informed them that Khalid wanted to see them both immediately. They exchanged a wary glance before following the assistant to Khalid's study. Inside, Khalid stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned to face them as they entered, his expression unreadable. "I have a task for the two of you," he said, his tone as commanding as ever. Amira felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of task?" she asked cautiously. Khalid's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment she thought she saw a glimmer of something darker in his eyes. "You'll find out soon enough," he said cryptically. "For now, all you need to know is that this task is crucial for the future of our family. Do not fail me." The ominous nature of his words hung heavy in the air as Amira and Malik left the study. As they walked back to the garden, Malik turned to her, his face pale. "I don't know what he's planning," he said quietly. "But whatever it is, it won't be good." Amira nodded, her resolve hardening. Whatever Khalid had in store for them, she knew they would have to face it together. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more sinister. The tension in the mansion was palpable after Khalid's cryptic instructions. Amira and Malik spent the following days in anxious silence, waiting to discover what Khalid had planned. The looming sense of unease was amplified by the constant presence of Khalid's staff, who moved about the mansion with an air of secrecy. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, a messenger arrived with an envelope. Khalid had summoned them to an estate on the outskirts of the city. The message was brief and offered no explanation, leaving them both on edge. Malik, however, seemed more resigned than surprised. "He's testing us," Malik muttered as they climbed into the waiting car. "That's how he operates, always pushing boundaries to see how far he can manipulate the people around him." Amira didn't respond, her thoughts racing. She stared out the window as the city lights gave way to a barren desert landscape. After nearly an hour, They arrived at an enormous estate, far more secluded than Khalid's main mansion. The structure was imposing, with high walls and an air of impenetrability. Inside, they were led to a grand hall where Khalid awaited them. He stood at the head of a long table, his expression as cold and calculating as ever. Beside him sat a man Amira didn't recognize, a business associate, perhaps, judging by his expensive suit and the air of authority he carried. "Good, you're here," Khalid said, gesturing for them to sit. Amira and Malik exchanged a wary glance before taking their seats. Khalid wasted no time. "This is Mr. Hassan al-Farouk," he said, nodding toward the man beside him. "He's one of our family's most important partners, and he has a request." Amira felt her stomach twist. A request? She didn't like the sound of that. Hassan leaned forward, his sharp eyes assessing both Amira and Malik. "Your marriage is a valuable union," he began, his voice smooth but menacing. "It strengthens your family's reputation, but it also presents an opportunity. I have an interest in expanding my business into the European market, and having an ally like you would be beneficial." Amira's heart sank as she realized what he was implying. This wasn't about their marriage or their future. It was about power and control. Khalid had orchestrated everything to solidify his influence, and now he was using them as pawns in his game. "I won't be a part of this," Malik said suddenly, his voice firm. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "You can't just treat us like commodities." Khalid's expression darkened, and he turned to Malik with a glare that could cut through steel. "Sit down," he commanded, his tone icy. "You will do as you're told." "No," Malik said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I've had enough of your manipulation. Amira and I deserve better than this." Amira's chest tightened as she watched the standoff unfold. She had never seen Malik stand up to his father before, and she could see the defiance in his eyes. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Khalid's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out. But instead, he smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down Amira's spine. "You think you can defy me?" Khalid said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what's at stake." He turned to Hassan, who smirked as though he were in on some cruel joke. "Very well," Khalid said. "If you won't cooperate willingly, I'll have to take matters into my own hands." Amira's heart raced as Khalid's words hung in the air. She didn't know what he meant, but she knew it wasn't good. Malik reached for her hand under the table, his grip firm and reassuring. For the first time, she felt a spark of hope. Not because the danger had passed, but because Malik was finally fighting back. As they left the estate that night, Amira couldn't shake the feeling that Khalid's plans were far from over. Whatever he had in store, it was clear that their defiance had only made him more determined. And while Malik's newfound courage gave her strength, she knew they were stepping into a battle they weren't prepared for. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Khalid's power would not be easily undone. The true test of their resilience was only beginning. The days following the confrontation at the estate were tense. Amira and Malik knew they had crossed a line with Khalid, but neither of them regretted it. For the first time, Malik had stood up to his father, and while it had brought them closer together, it had also placed them squarely in Khalid's crosshairs. Khalid's retaliation came swiftly. Malik received a message summoning him to the family's financial headquarters, a towering skyscraper in the heart of Dubai. The message was cryptic, but the tone was clear. It was not a request. Malik insisted on going alone, but Amira refused to let him face Khalid without support. Together they arrived at the building, their resolve unshaken despite the growing sense of dread. The reception area was sleek and imposing, with marble floors and glass walls that reflected the city's skyline. Khalid's assistant greeted them with a polite smile that did nothing to mask the tension in the air. They were led to Khalid's private office, an opulent space that overlooked the city. Khalid sat behind a massive desk, his fingers steepled as he regarded them with a cold smile. "You've made quite a mess," Khalid began, his tone calm but laced with menace. "Your defiance at the estate was disappointing. But I expected no less from you, Malik." Malik remained silent, his jaw tight as he stared at his father. Amira stood beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. Khalid rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the city. "I built this empire from nothing," he said, his voice heavy with pride. "Every decision I've made has been to secure the future of this family, and now you dare to question my authority?" "I'm not questioning it," Malik said, his voice steady. "I'm rejecting it. You can't control me anymore." Khalid turned to face him, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can escape my influence? Everything you have, your education, your wealth, your status, comes from me. Without me, you are nothing." The words stung, but Malik didn't waver. "Then I'll be nothing," he said. "But at least I'll be free." Khalid's expression darkened, and he stepped closer to them. "You don't understand what you're doing. You're throwing away everything for what? This girl? This sham of a rebellion?" Amira felt a surge of anger at his words. She stepped forward, her voice firm. "This isn't about rebellion. It's about living our lives on our terms. You may have built this empire, but it doesn't give you the right to control us." Khalid's eyes flashed with fury, but before he could respond, his assistant entered the room, whispering something in his ear. Khalid's demeanor shifted, and he nodded sharply. "It seems our discussion will have to wait," he said, his tone cold. "But know this isn't over. You will both regret defying me." As they left the office, Malik let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "He's not going to back down," he said quietly. "He'll do whatever it takes to break us." Amira nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we won't give him the chance." But Khalid was a man who thrived on control, and he wasn't about to let them slip through his grasp. That evening they received an anonymous tip. An envelope slid under the door of their room at the mansion. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a warning. "Leave now before it's too late." The note sent a chill down Amira's spine. She turned to Malik, who was already packing a bag. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. This is his way of reminding us that he's always watching. Amira hesitated, her heart torn. "But where will we go? He has influence everywhere." Malik stopped and looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "We'll figure it out. As long as we're together, we'll find a way." With little more than the clothes on their backs, they left the mansion under the cover of darkness. The streets of Dubai seemed colder, less welcoming, as they navigated the city in search of safety. Malik led them to a small, nondescript apartment owned by a friend he trusted, a rare ally in a world dominated by Khalid's reach. As they settled into the cramped space, Amira couldn't help but feel the weight of their situation. They were fugitives in a way, running from a man who held all the power. But as Malik took her hand, She felt a spark of hope. They had defied Khalid before, and they would do it again. But deep down, she knew their escape was only the beginning. Khalid wouldn't stop until he had them back under his control, and the battle for their freedom was far from over. Amira and Malik's escape was short-lived. Khalid's influence reached far and wide, and within days, his men tracked them to the small apartment. But instead of sending his guards to force them back, Khalid himself arrived. He offered Malik a final ultimatum: return home and continue the family legacy, or be cut off from everything: money, power, and even his last name. Malik, holding Amira's hand tightly, stood firm. "I don't need your name or your wealth. All I need is my freedom." Khalid's face betrayed a flicker of surprise before he nodded, his voice cold. "Then you're no longer my son." As Khalid walked away, Amira and Malik felt an overwhelming sense of loss, but also a newfound freedom. They had sacrificed everything for a chance to live on their terms, and in that moment, they knew it was worth it. Together, they would build a life free of Khalid's shadow, proving that love and courage could triumph over even the greatest power. If this story inspired you, remember, true freedom often comes at a cost, but it's always worth fighting for. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who needs to believe in the power of courage and love.